Ashu, since you're one of the industry leaders in this space. Welcome. Ashu is the general partner at Foundation Capital.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So Ashu, before we get started on our discussions, I'd like you to outline your personal journey. I've known you for now, I think, 15 years.
Yeah,
Time
maybe
flies,
more.
so maybe more.
We're both getting old.
But as you got to Foundation, before you got to Foundation, what is your personal journey, and also through Foundation Capital?
So, my life has been a series of serendipitous events. And it's a little bit of a random walk. I grew up in Sudan in Nigeria. Was born in India, grew up in Sudan and Nigeria. Went back to India for high school. Didn't really know what I wanted to do, but fortunately was good in math, and so I got an IIT, ended up being an engineer, started my career with Unilever, my first job out of school, out of IIT, which was a relatively nerdy place, and I started off as a sales manager. So my first job out of college was managing a 50-person sales team in Maharashtra, India, selling soap and toothpaste. And I went from that to running Unilever Nepal, then ended up joining McKinsey, to build out McKinsey's software practice in India, and then over time became part of the practice globally. Then in the late 90s, I did a startup in India, trying to do local search in India before that was cool. Learned a lot of good lessons, but failed. Shut the company down after the 2000 recession. Moved to the US, had a stint at Cadence Design Systems, running strategy and marketing, then ran field marketing for Microsoft globally, built out the enterprise business at Microsoft, then went on to run the ads business at Microsoft. And I left to do a startup. And the way I got a venture, in fact, I think it was around the time we first met, was I was looking at startup ideas myself, and I was hanging out in the offices of one of the venture firms when you were pitching your company at Frankina.
Yes.
And one thing led to another, but at some point in the process, one of the venture firms, Foundation, that I was pitching my idea to said, hey, we don't really like the idea, but you're an interesting guy. Come hang out with us for a little bit. And that was more than 11 years ago, and I'm still there.
That's quite an interesting background. Actually, I didn't know you had been in Sudan, and I'm not sure you want to be in Sudan these days, but
it's fun. It was fun as a kid. These days, a little less so.
So, after you got into Foundation, can you describe as to how Foundation has evolved as a firm, what kind of areas you're investing in? Just give us a little bit of color.
So, Foundation's been in business since '95. Mm-hmm. And over that time frame, we've probably made 175 investments, of which 28 companies have gone on to be public companies. So we've been very fortunate to work with some remarkable entrepreneurs, including Reed Hastings, who started Pure Software and then, of course, is better known for Netflix. In that journey, we've invested in enterprise companies, consumer companies, and fintech. So we have a very broad portfolio over time. Within the enterprise space, we've done everything up and down the stack. So we've invested in silicon companies. We were the first investors in Atheros that really invented Wi-Fi. We're investors in Cerebras, in GraphCore, both of the, two of the leading AI chip companies. But we've also invested in application companies and then everything in between. We've had, over the years, many investments in the IoT space as well. I'll date myself going back in history. Dust Networks was building a proprietary network akin to Wi-Fi for IoT almost 10 years ago. That experiment failed. I think it was ahead of its time. Mm-hmm. And so, we've had some of those too. But I would say broadly today, we look at the world and say there's a massive opportunity in cybersecurity. The perimeter is exploding. I think IoT is a big part of that. As the perimeter explodes, the surface area to protect is expanding continuously, as is the value of assets are in the digital world relative to the physical world. There's a shift in value. I was reading somewhere that there's more than $20 trillion spent on arms, ammunition, and armies. Mm-hmm. And so 20 years from now, there's no reason why cybersecurity couldn't be a $20 trillion market. That's how I think about it. So I think there's a massive, in the near term, we think there's a $1 trillion cybersecurity opportunity, up and down the stack and across the surface. I think the second big space for us has really been the impact of machine learning and AI across the stack. And you see it everything from inference at the endpoint, so people are looking at inference chips in IoT devices, to storage has been reinvented over the last few years. So we're investors in Cohesity, and when Cohesity first started, everyone looked at it and said, why do you need a new storage system? But it's really the impact of the explosion in data and the fact that you need data both in the cloud and in on-prem for machine learning and AI applications that's really driven the growth in Cohesity and other players in that space, all the way to application companies that are leveraging machine learning or AI for task automation or for predictive analytics.
Got it. At Fabric, we have a favorite saying that we are reimagining infrastructure in the modern world. In that context, security is part of the infrastructure play. What do you think of the fact that there is a big talk about edge computing, distributed clouds, distributed compute? So what are your opinions, and is Foundation looking into that space?
Absolutely. So I think there's 2 or 3 aspects to the question. If you look at the core infrastructure world, over the last decade, what we have seen is public clouds eat away at traditional on-prem infrastructure providers. And over time, you've seen AWS and now more recently Google and Microsoft really climb from the bottom of the stack to create more and more competition for traditional infrastructure providers. But as they have done that, it has created opportunities for a whole new class of providers, because the shift from on-prem to the cloud is a journey. 5 years ago, people would say it's either on-prem or cloud. I think now we're wiser.
Yep.
We know it's a hybrid multi-cloud world.
Yes.
And infrastructure for enterprises to live in a hybrid multi-cloud world doesn't exist. I mean, bits and pieces of it do, but there's a whole new fabric, to use, no pun intended, there's a whole new fabric that needs to be created in the data centers and in the infrastructure world. In addition, I think we're starting to see compute and storage move back to the edge for many use cases, driven by machine learning and AI needs to a large extent. Because if you're going to have inference happen in a car, there's no way you can send the data back up to the cloud and bring it back.
Right.
If you're doing video surveillance,
Yep.
it's much harder to take all of that video feeds and feed it back to the cloud. Now, maybe a subset and maybe for training, but more and more, I think we will see the pendulum shift the other way. That compute is coming back more to the edge. And in fact, you see it with, even NVIDIA's latest announcements. I mean, for the first time, NVIDIA now has chips for IoT endpoints with GPUs in them, so you can do inference at the endpoint. And we see that in our company, GraphCore, as well, which is serving that market.
So how many investments do you have lately in the infrastructure space? Mind you, I'm rather biased towards infrastructure.
No, right.
Fabric's
And we love infrastructure. It's a gift that keeps on giving. I'm trying to do a rough count. My guess is probably around 25.
Okay.
We probably have 40 active enterprise investments, of the roughly half for infrastructure broadly defined.
Would you consider security as part of infrastructure?
Absolutely. And I think more and more, as the cloud providers have taken over other aspects of infrastructure, security is becoming more center stage. Because as an enterprise, you want some control. And as you give up control of the physical layer, you start to create more control on top of that, including, I think, all the way to application security.
So you made some very powerful statements on security. You said it could be how many $1 trillion? I love that.
I said physical security is a $20 trillion market. I definitely think security can be a $1 trillion market in the near future. And then I think the sky's the limit.
Yeah, I heard CrowdStrike filed just recently, and it seems like going to be a blockbuster IPO. What are the promising companies that you have in your portfolio in the security space, and what type of security? Where do you see security evolving? Where do you see the near-term opportunities in security?
So, by definition, companies that are closer to exit, identified opportunities many years ago.
Correct.
And so we're investors in Venafi that does key management. And key management is an incredibly complex space, driven again by the fact that you have keys not just in the data center, but every phone, every device has in many cases dozens of keys. And so Venafi is doing really well, and we see that being a public company in the next couple of years. We're also very early investors in ForgeRock. ForgeRock is in the identity management space. Identities have exploded. We all have dozens of digital identities today, and ForgeRock helps enterprises manage those. And so they have, the SMB and consumer version of that has really been Okta, which is a fabulous success. The high-end enterprise version of for identity management for ForgeRock, and so we see that to be a large success for us. But if I, zoom back and say, what are the companies that are early in our portfolio, and where do we see the long-term opportunity? Well, in part, I think we see there's opportunity in security everywhere. It's a whack-a-mole game. So, everything that was a solved problem 2 years ago now is unsolved again because someone's discovered some new angle. So with that, I think there's opportunity everywhere, first, in security. But if I were to get specific, I would say, I think security for IoT devices and endpoints, I think is a huge unsolved problem.
Okay.
And so we've been looking at companies actually, and the definition of IoT continues to expand. A few years ago, you wouldn't have thought of industrial devices as IoT. So, I ran a manufacturing plant at Unilever, and we had SCADA systems.
Got it. Yeah.
Those SCADA systems weren't connected to the internet in any way 20 years ago. Today, there are ways to get in. In fact, one of the hotels in Vegas got invaded through someone getting into a fish tank and using the fish tank network to get into the main network. So all of these endpoints, a fish tank control system, a SCADA system in a factory, a valve in a manufacturing plant, or a water valve out in a dam, these are all IoT devices. So I think the footprint of IoT devices, I think, is a very interesting opportunity. Secondly, as we are giving up more and more of our infrastructure to the cloud providers at the lower layers, application security, I think, is a huge opportunity. And there are ways, people are talking about shifting left in application security, and I think that is definitely one class of problems, one approach to solving a problem. The other approach to solving a problem has been encryption. And so I incubated a company called Fortanix, which enables you to do encryption in runtime. So encryption at rest or encryption on the wire has been a solved problem for a while. But all security risks arise because at the time of execution, you have to decrypt both code and data. Right. And that's when it's vulnerable. Fortanix actually allows you to run encrypted code and encrypted data into a trusted enclave on the chip, leveraging a technology called SGX that Intel has released as part of its newer versions. And then you really decrypt only within that trusted enclave. And so Fortanix initial point of entry was the HSM market. They have expanded into key management more broadly and encrypted keys. And over time, I think their vision is to make sure that all applications can run encrypted in the cloud. So that's just a start. I mean, we could go on and on. Security is a huge footprint of opportunities.
That's wonderful to hear. We have a couple of companies in security and IoT, which we would like to bring to you sometime.
Absolutely.
So you have done, interestingly, just like we do the Spotlight series, you have done some podcasts.
Yes.
Like for you to tell me what you think. I mean, I'd like to learn from you, and what type of themes do you drive in these podcasts? What is the intent for these podcasts? A little bit about that.
So, the podcast, it's a funny story. It actually started off very casually in a video recording, very much like this. I was keen to do a video of Dheeraj Pandey talking about his personal life story. And I did a 2.5-hour recording. I wasn't as efficient as you might be. And at the end of 2 hours, when we started editing the video, we realized that it seemed just more amenable to a podcast as against a video. We felt there more people would listen to it on their drive in than watch. Neither Dheeraj or I are that good looking. So neither of us have your looks. And so we decided to get rid of our looks and just do a podcast. That's how it started a couple of years ago. But on a more serious note, the podcast is really an opportunity for successful founders to give back. They share their life story. They talk about lessons learned, mistakes they have made over time, and advice for very specific problems. And the response to it has been overwhelming. I mean, it was not a big project. It didn't start off as an official project. I did it on a weekend. I got my own crew in. I paid for it from my pocket. It just sort of took off. And now it's a much bigger project for us as a firm. And the reason I think it's been so popular is that most founders are constantly looking for additional sources they're looking for more signal, more advice, more opinions. And they get them from their investors, they get them from angel, from advisors, but not that many founders have access to a Dheeraj Pandey or a Mohit Aaron or or an Aaron Levy. And to really get Aaron's opinion on a specific problem is very useful. And that's what that's what the podcast has become.
That's great. And you have known about the fabric. We have spent a lot of time talking about the various things. I'd like to have your opinion from outside in to see what we are doing in the space. How do you see the fabric, and would love to get your take on it.
So, I'm a huge fan of the fabric, and I'm a huge fan of what both of you are doing, primarily because the nature of startups in the infrastructure space is it's not about some macro big picture idea. Yes, people start there, but it's about finding a specific point of insertion. And most technical founders may have a deep technical insight, but they struggle to find the right point of insertion into the market. Most business folks may have opinions on the point of insertion, but they don't have an understanding of what the technology is capable of. And what you have done very uniquely is you have enough technical chops to understand what technology is capable of and to translate what a technical founder has in their head. And you have this vast amount of market knowledge that you can bring to bear to say, this is how we should take this technology to market. And sometimes maybe you write a little bit of code, but I doubt that your code is that good. So I think, but that insight, that ability to bring technical knowledge and market knowledge together at the point of entry at a customer I think is very rare. And I think you guys bring a lot of value to that.
Thanks. I think you elaborate better what we do than we do, so I should use some of the articulation.
All I ask is I get a toll tax. 1% of every company.
So, as a part of the IoT story, which you actually elaborate on quite well, there's also the 5G that's coming along. 5G, as somebody told me, edge does not need 5G, but 5G needs the edge. So I was just curious, what do you think about 5G? Where do you think it applies, and how do you think it's going to transform, and what kind of applications can take advantage of it? It's a broad question, but I'm just curious.
I'm super excited about 5G, and the reason I'm excited about 5G is, consumer applications have not seen much of an innovation in the last decade. The last big innovation was the iPhone. And that led to Uber and Lyft and Airbnb and a whole array of new companies. And I think we have all been starved, actually, of a disruptive change for the last decade. As investors, as entrepreneurs, these disruptive changes create new opportunities. And I think that's what 5G is. I think 5G, when we look back 10 years from now, will be as seminal an event as the iPhone was in 2007. So that's that's the high level. Now, what will it change? To some extent, it's hard to predict. But the fact that you will have this incredible bandwidth available all the way to the edge, I think will change the way we think about network architectures. It will change the way we think about how we, what compute we do at the edge versus what we do in the cloud. It'll change the way you design consumer applications. It will change how you think about endpoints of all kinds. And so I actually think it's not about changing IoT or changing any one thing. I think 5G will enable people to rethink the entire stack. And it's only when it starts becoming pervasive will those changes happen. I mean, you could imagine what the iPhone would do, but I don't think you would ever come up with Uber without actually using it.
Absolutely.
And I think the same will happen with 5G.
That's excellent. In our last Fabric annual event, we had a talk on 5G, and this was one of the topics that we covered, and it's fascinating to see how it's been evolving. So I want to thank you for the time you spent with us, but as a parting advice for our audience, they could be entrepreneurs, most I expect, or potentially other investors. Any parting advice that you would give to the entrepreneurs or our audience in general?
I think it's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur today, as it is today. I mean, first and foremost, I think we're living in a time where innovation is being rewarded by customers in a way that it's never been. I mean, look at the success of enterprise companies in the public markets. Both public markets and customers are hungry for more and more enterprise companies. So I think it's a great time to be an enterprise founder. I think secondly, you talked about 5G, but 5G, the changes in the cloud infrastructure all present disruptive opportunities. And as entrepreneurs, you're riding that wave of disruption. So I think it's a great time to be a founder, and call Rajan or me, or hopefully both of us. As I say, just dial 1-800 Ashu Garg.
So, Ashu, we talked about your advice to entrepreneurs. What are the pitfalls do you think they need to watch out for, avoid, or anything from your experience?
The best founders are paranoid because there's failure at every turn. And unfortunately, it doesn't get easier as you start to go faster. You just have to sort of be better at balancing the bike as you're riding harder as companies get bigger. If we started talking about the laundry list, we'd be here all day. But there's a couple of things to think about. I think first and foremost, your co-founder and the first few people you hire really define the culture of a company. And I think not enough people spend enough time thinking about, do I really want to be married to this person for the next decade? Because you're probably going to spend more time with your co-founder than you will with your spouse. So that's one. And I'm stating the obvious, but I'm still surprised at how many people sort of have regrets later on that aspect. I think the second thing I would say is look for really large markets. No matter how good your technology, very few startups can create a market. Most startups ride a market, and you can zig and zag in a large market and change direction. But if you don't have a market to begin with, market creation is hard for startups. The third thing I would say, just to wrap up, is most technologists, and I've been guilty of this many times as an engineer, most technologists undervalue the role of sales and the go-to-market function. Selling is hard. Just try cold calling for 20 cold calls a day for a week, and I think you'll find out how hard selling is. And so one of the pitfalls is most people don't invest enough time in the sales process. Yep. And then they're surprised why customers don't buy.
Thank you, Ashu, for your insightful talk, and stay tuned for our next Spotlight episode.